My name is Ellen Waldman, and I'm the new Vice President of Advocacy and Educational Outreach. And I've worked for many years in academia, researching, writing, and planting little ADR seeds amidst the next generation of lawyers. My role at CPR is to expand and deepen CPR's already significant footprint as a major thought leader in the ADR arena, and to strengthen our ties with existing and potential academic partners. I look forward to meeting many of you and working together to advance CPR's mission. We've heard so much in the last 2 days about the power of creative problem solving and the many ways in which conflict can be managed or avoided altogether. If you have suggestions for additional areas CPR should be digging into or particular initiatives, please get in touch. So this next panel is representative of the sophisticated and innovative work of CPR's Healthcare and Life Sciences Committee. The panel is moderated by Danny TOBEY, for whom the description triple threat doesn't even begin to capture it. Danny is a litigator at DLA Piper, a medical doctor and software entrepreneur who represents life science, technology, and healthcare clients in a variety of regulatory and litigation matters involving the FDA, CDC, HHS, CMS, private payers, and tort and commercial litigants. Danny leads the firm's team that assists companies navigating the legal landscape of emerging and disruptive technologies, including AI and data science. In 2019, Danny received a Burton Award from the Library of Congress, recognizing the best of the best writers in the legal profession among the nation's top 1,000 largest law firms. And though this is not in his official bio, he's written 2 books of fiction that have been favorably reviewed on Goodreads and Amazon. So maybe a quadruple threat or a cyborg who doesn't need sleep. I guess Danny can answer that, but I'd now like to turn the proverbial mic over to Danny to proceed with the panel.
Thank you, Ellen, for that extremely overly kind introduction. Not a cyborg, but also don't sleep, mostly because I have a lot of kids running around the house. No better excuse than that, but thank you. So let me start by thanking everyone, Alan, and the whole team here at CPR for having us today. This is a really interesting conversation. I hope you'll agree over the next little bit with 2, in my opinion, of the thought leaders in this area who are not sort of up in the academic clouds, but really on the ground, seeing how artificial intelligence and machine learning and data analytics can be employed on the front lines of healthcare to improve outcomes for patients, better detection of disease, more consistency and scalability in healthcare access, and new innovations on ways to address some of these healthcare problems that have eluded human minds for a long time, and now we're getting to put some new tools towards those and come up with new solutions. My panelists also know what some of the challenges are of employing these new technologies and have been on the front lines of regulatory and governance efforts to ensure that AI and related technologies are rolled out in a safe and efficacious way. And all of that, of course, at the end of the day, hopefully, if everything goes well, leads to the resolution of disputes or the prevention of disputes. And we'll talk a lot about that today. I'm going to ask my guests to introduce themselves along with the first question. One note, unfortunately, Julian Willem couldn't be with us today. He got sick and told me it was okay to tell you. He thinks it's COVID, but he's doing great, and was really sorry he couldn't be with us today and was really trying to be here. So we're going to have 2 panelists. I'm going to try to help them out, that they don't have to carry all the extra weight, and I'll throw in some comments too along the way. And also David, who will introduce himself in a second, was very kind. He has some slides that he's going to go through in lieu of our 3rd panelist to sort of give an overview of some of the regulatory issues in this space. I'll just do very quick introductions and then let Michelle and David introduce themselves. I will say that they are both old friends, both people I have been working with professionally and extracurricularly on these issues of AI in healthcare for a number of years. So I'm really delighted to have them, and I know we'll have a great conversation. I'll start with David, and then Michelle, please introduce yourself to this group. And after that, start by just giving a little general background of where you were seeing AI starting to be deployed in healthcare and life sciences. David, why don't you kick off?
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks, Danny, for the invitation. So David Vital, I'm a lawyer who actually went right from law school into working with a really innovative startup, building AI and software as a medical device for healthcare, and didn't know what I was getting into at the time, but really fortunate to have been in this situation. We were building a software as a medical device product that was automatically detecting diabetic retinopathy in the eye. So if you have diabetes, you're supposed to go for an annual exam to determine whether you have diabetic retinopathy. But typically that exam is with an ophthalmologist or an eye care specialist, and access to care was an issue, or is an issue still actually. And so what we did is we created this algorithm with our company to bring that diagnostic capability for diabetic retinopathy from the specialist's office to the front lines of care. After many rounds, which you may get into with the FDA over the course of years, about 4 years, we got our FDA clearance, and it's still, I guess, being called the first autonomous software as a medical device clearance by the FDA applied to medical care. And along with that came a lot of really, really fascinating issues. It was really interesting listening to Craig about autonomous vehicles, same types of considerations that we had to go through, one of which was liability. And our company actually took liability for the output of that result, which I think to date is probably the only one that I know of that has taken liability and responsibility for the output. We also were able to get a CPT code, which meant that our algorithm could actually be run and then billed to Medicare. Again, kind of highlighting the autonomy of that result. So after about almost 7 years with that company, I was general counsel and doing a lot of that. I ended up taking a job with Mayo Clinic. And so I'm here at Mayo Clinic now. I've been here for about 1.5 years. And what I'm working on is really taking the foundational learnings that we had from that previous company and the regulation and a whole bunch of these ethical and bias and other issues, and building a framework for all of Mayo Clinic to be able to take advantage of the algorithms that are being built here and applied to medical care. So I'm sure we'll get into a little more, but I'll pass it over to Michelle to make her intro.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Danny. I'm Michelle Adelaide. I have been practicing law for quite some time. I've spent the last 17 years at Pfizer, and before that I was at Bristol Myers Squibb. When I first started in-house, I was in litigation. So I was clearly working on dispute resolution in many aspects of pharmaceutical law. And over the years at Pfizer, I've had the great pleasure of being able to move to where my interests lie, and kind of restart my career over and over again. For many years, I was working in our emerging markets, trying to assist in some very delicate areas around the most needed areas of the world, and helping the business try to understand how to operate in those areas, to kind of ensure that we were helping and not harming, as well as, avoiding liability issues. I then moved into our products area and was kind of in the asset lawyer for various marketed products. And during that time, I started to really get involved in data and how the business was analyzing data, how the business was advertising in new, at the time, and emerging digital technologies. And we started to develop a process to ensure that when we were engaging in those areas, we were doing so responsibly and learning how to compliantly do so in, the beginnings of kind of the social media era of advertising. And over the years, that, of course, has grown into many different areas of digital technology. I recently moved into a new position that was created really because of kind of this changing tide of technology assisting healthcare in some areas that we hope will improve patients' lives, right? So, how can a pharmaceutical company who has a whole lot of clinical data and research understand and help to assist in the healthcare solutions, hopefully, ensuring that we are addressing areas of disparity that we haven't been able to address before. And it's been an interesting ride so far because we see the good that can come when we can address these issues from this population health perspective, when we know we have the leadership, the skills, and the data to kind of impact these areas. However, we're certainly still within a very regulated regime with kind of all of the old and tried and tested theories of liability, and we're trying to figure out how to appropriately make sure that we are a part of the disruptive technologies that are going to change this landscape and are changing this landscape while doing so responsibly. And this has been something that, has been evolving over the years. I can't say that, we are just getting into this space. We have been in this space. Years and years of digital technology has resulted in, trying to overcome redundant processes, trying to free up people's time so that they can spend time on the issues that matter for patients and physicians. So, when we got this large digital organization that has come together with, state-of-the-art expertise, we've managed to find ways to use AI in the life cycle of pharma to help understand how to find the targets that will matter, help the researchers get past some of the stuff that would bog them down and really didn't need humans to do the work, right? You could try to assemble that research and get to the science of it. And then as we bring that forward, besides the research and understanding what we can do to kind of make research move faster, we are also trying to ensure that we're using AI to help responsibly and appropriately ensure that we can identify safety issues and address those safety issues as they arise. And then more interestingly, trying to figure out how to use technology to help us truly be able to help physicians spot things that haven't been known before. If you think about the chronic diseases or people that you may know in your lives that are suffering from something that they can't pinpoint, right? And doctors have a hard time pinpointing what that is. How can we use the information that we're using in discovery and development to help identify things that doctors might not be able to see at first glance because it's too rare or it's not happening commonly enough? And so can you use technology to bring all of that information together to highlight what those symptoms are? It's a very interesting area to be in, but it's also a very challenging area from a legal perspective. And I think we're going to get into that.
We will, absolutely. And maybe I'll even just throw that one wide open since we are at a dispute resolution panel. It was great hearing Craig talk about levels of autonomy in autonomous vehicles, and where does the human driver come in? Where does the vehicle come in? And as my panelists both know, because we talk about these issues all the time, and David and I work together with the AMA on these issues, the American Medical Association wants to rebrand AI as augmented intelligence instead of artificial intelligence. And that's very important to them because they want to keep a very human-centric model of healthcare delivery for numerous ethical and safety and trade reasons. Automation will play a role in healthcare going forward. And Michelle, you've already said there are things that researchers don't need to be doing that are roadblocks. And David, you talked about your device was meant to be, and in fact, labeled by FDA as autonomous. It went so far as to say, primary care physician, do not overread this test result. You will be violating your warranty if you do. So one thing that I think about a lot in working with clients on this is, where are the lines of responsibility between traditional human actors, in our case, in the healthcare setting, and the devices we're creating that are increasingly creative and autonomous in their decision-making process? And it's always at those interactions between machine and human where batons can get dropped, and we always pay attention to that. What are you guys seeing in your experience with the role of humans, the role of machines, and how that line is blurring? David, I'm going to kick that to you.
Yeah, it's entirely risk-based. And right now, with respect to FDA, everything still has physician oversight. Even the one that we're calling autonomous, it's for use by primary care physicians. So it's having an impact on care, but more so with respect to workflow automation, or as Michelle identified, finding those tasks that are either redundant or simple, and they're just repetitive tasks that are taking the physician time away from where they really should be focusing with that patient care and really applying their higher level clinical expertise. So it's a very slow build, but right now, pretty much everything that's applied to healthcare is still puts the responsibility in the hands of the physician or the healthcare organization. However, and the FDA frameworks are starting to see this and acknowledge it, there's more and more algorithms out there that are starting to have a greater influence over that physician. So the FDA would define that as driving care. So rather than just an algorithm that informs the clinician of something, it's actually providing the clinician something that they're likely to rely on. And when we get into that space, I think we start to get into some really, really interesting legal questions about who then takes the liability, really similar to what Craig was talking about earlier. And my opinion, this is just my opinion, coming from a company that did take liability, is it depends on the product. It depends on that algorithm that we're deploying. But what should happen is that it should be in the hands of the entity best positioned to take that liability, right? So if we're doing an algorithm that is just informing a clinician, but that clinician can repeat the work entirely themselves, maybe it takes them 4 times the amount of time, but they have the ability to do that, it would make sense that that clinician could still hold on to the ultimate responsibility. But if we create an algorithm that the clinician has no ability to dig it under the hood and figure out what happened, and the clinician is still using that to drive care, the algorithm company starts to take on a lot more responsibility. How that algorithm is built, whether they have involved clinical expertise into their model, whether it aligns to the clinical standard of care, that company should have more responsibility to answer those types of questions. And when they're answering those types of questions, you start to wonder, well, maybe they should actually be more responsible for that. So very algorithm dependent, but some of the frameworks that are coming out from the FDA and some of what we're working on at Mayo Clinic really has that leveling up of what are you intending to do, and based off of that, who should hold responsibility.
I think I'm going to just cause a lively debate here. Because I'm starting to think of technology in the same way we think of medicine, right? And obviously there are things that are medicine in the tech world. And even if they're not, if it is an algorithm that is driving or informing regardless of what it's doing, I think we all have the same responsibilities to ensure we know what is happening, how it's happening, what is the best scientific knowledge about that, and how we can ensure that we are not, I mean, this goes to that augmented as well as, the autonomous, right? We are not going to mindlessly follow technology to the detriment of our expertise. So there's an obligation in my mind to ensure that when an entity or an individual is going to take up that technology, that they understand the how, the why, they can see it, and they believe it, or they can do their research behind it. Now you get into these issues of drift and shift and things that try to kind of change what's happening in that technological advancement, right? So as a decision is being offered up, did it take the data and do what you expected it to do, or did it not? Did it give you an alternative response? Or did it move in a way you didn't expect, either because your data wasn't trained that way, or you couldn't see what was actually happening? There are certainly new issues and risks associated with relying on technology to inform and arguably to drive decision making, raises the responsibilities. But I would say that, when we're talking about these professional fields, however you as a physician learn your information, you still have that obligation to learn that prior to taking on this technology. I think in the new field of how fast things are coming into play, we're going to have to ensure that the software isn't blindly getting put into systems, and that physicians and healthcare practices understand that if a decision is coming in, they had looked at it the same way they would keep up with their continuing medical education to understand why and how it's working. And if they don't believe in it, they shouldn't use it. If they need to stop and question why or if something else is happening, they still have the same responsibilities to do so. But on the other end, I am going to say that this is not going to be a simple decision-making process to figure out who's got responsibility over what, because we're going into a different state of mind. We're in a different, I often think about the GPS, right? I'll put my GPS on to a location that I've never been to before, and I start it when I'm at home, right? Those first 10 steps that come in, I don't need to be following because I know how to get to the parkway. However, there are so many times that I just get in the car and it's telling me to make a left turn when I know I should take a right turn, and I take a left turn. But I knew that I didn't need to take the left to take another left to get back to the right. So, the same concept can apply inside of healthcare, and should. We have to make sure that we don't blindly start taking things without recognizing that we are the professionals in the space and have to stop and think. I'm going to make one more point, and then, we could be on this forever, obviously, but the notion of distracted driving, right? Something's coming up with you, while you're driving, and that can cause an accident. You can think of the same concept happening if a decision is coming up to a physician as the physician is in the room with the patient. And all of a sudden, you're not listening to the patient anymore because you're looking at the little things that are coming up on your screen saying, press here, and this will tell you your next action. What can we do to kind of ensure that that doesn't happen so blindlessly? We should start to be thinking about serving up the same or similar information to the patient and having that shared portal. So the shared decision-making, if they can see something coming up, they can now ask the questions and make sure you're all still on the same topic. So I think there's a lot of room to grow in this space to figure out where and how to apportion kind of responsibility and liability. But I also think there's a lot of growth that has to happen from regulatory perspectives to make sure that we are doing so consistently throughout the environment.
Okay, I will jump in and assume my burden as substitute third panelist. Not that you guys need any help filling the time, but I just can't Can't resist taking the bait, Michelle. So I will start a lively debate with you now. I heard you saying that there should always be, and maybe I'm overcharacterizing here, but just for the sake of fun, always be a trained professional between the device and the ultimate subject, the patient, who is employing her independent judgment, taking the device as one factor among many. Some might even call that person a learned intermediary. That is obviously at the heart of defenses in litigation and disputes that arise around who owed what to whom. And a traditional defense, I'm sure everyone on this panel and on this call knows, that plays a big role in defenses in product liability litigation and other things. However, I wrote a paper a few years ago, which David knows because it's actually how we ended up connecting, arguing that as AI became increasingly autonomous and independent and in fact better informed than the traditional intermediary, what happens to that defense? And we are already seeing, I think, instances where professionals, whether it's a doctor, a lawyer, there have been cases of judges, paralyzed because an algorithm is telling them to do one thing and their training and instinct is telling them to do something else. And they don't know if they're going to get sued for following the algorithm or for disregarding the algorithm. And there's a classic example of a judge who every instinct told her to keep alleged criminal or a defendant and accused in prison rather than grant bond. The bond algorithm said, no, this person's low risk. So she went with the algorithm, and that person was released and that very weekend committed a heinous crime. And when they asked the judge about this, the judge said, well, but there's this, scientific algorithm that's telling you all the factors say low risk. Who am I to override that with intuition to put someone in jail when they might, or in prison when they might not need to be in jail? And it goes another direction too. So I'm curious, do you guys think this is a sliding scale where eventually it's going to be too much to ask the human operator to always be in the responsible position of being able to override a controversial recommendation from an algorithm?
I'll jump right in since I probably prompted this coming up. And I guess what I will say is, I've always been intrigued with the artificial intelligence genre of movies, right? And it scares me to death to think that an actual autonomous thing is going to take over my ability to make judgments. And I would argue that we're in this place of this sliding scale because government regulation and understanding of how to adapt our laws and guidance to this new environment is lagging. So we're taking a stagnant view of the learned intermediary doctrine, right? And we're taking a stagnant view of how we should be evaluating this technology before it comes into use, as it is being used, and how we can make changes to it, right? You have in the pharmaceutical industry, a really, really robust pharmacovigilance kind of understanding. When you put medicine into, people, what our responsibility is. It doesn't end. As a pharmaceutical company, we don't put it out there and just say, okay, this is how it went in 20 years ago, and we haven't learned anything. We're not going to tell you anything else. When you think about this idea of what we're putting into technical solutions, I don't think we're coming fast enough along with understanding what the requirements need to be. And so we as humans have to start responsibly ensuring that we can understand and react and pivot when things are happening. So I'm not saying that the entity or individual that puts that technology into the stream of commerce doesn't have an ongoing obligation to evaluate and evolve and inform, right? That's the key. It's this concept of this shift and drift that the data world uses, that maybe in the data world, it means something to them, that they're like, okay, I know when it's shifting, I know when it's drifting. I couldn't even explain to you technically what they think of with shift and drift. But when I think of the concepts of shift and drift, I think of legal responsibilities to ensure we're understanding whether we are responsible for something changing within the development of that algorithm and informing the people that are using it of that. And if we have somehow let go and it is now in somebody else's domain, they are required to monitor and review that shift and drift and ensure that their people understand. I'm sure most people understand that the pharmaceutical company's responsibility for putting an algorithm into, a healthcare solution is a different responsibility than if, David is just helping his institution put it into his institution's use, right? Those regulations aren't the same. In fact, they could do so very freely. We can't, right? And so is that right though? Right? Because if you've got, I don't mean that they should be regulated. I mean, shouldn't we all make sure that we're doing the same things to ensure that when an algorithm is shifting and drifting, you're taking the same steps that I'm taking? Just because I'm outside and you're inside doesn't mean we both don't need the appropriate governance and monitoring and actions necessary to be able to ensure that if we put the same algorithm into the stream of commerce, we're both monitoring the same things. And right now, I don't know that there's any requirement that happens.
I love that you said that, because I come from industry. We were a very heavily regulated product that had to go through the FDA, and that was all my learning. And now I'm coming into a healthcare driven industry, which is the practice of medicine, but working on taking those principles and those controls that I learned through regulation and applying them so that there's more of a seamless connection. And some of the comments are asking about the black box. And this is a perfect, I think, tie into what you're saying, and I think what we're saying as well, where I think there's obligations on both sides, right? We all need to advance our learning and our understanding of this technology, and we all need to work together to find some form of standardization to how to communicate these things. And that goes in terms of the technology itself, explaining how it works, what it's doing, what information is being provided to you, and what we're doing versus what we're expecting you to do in that relationship. And that comes in the form of contracting as well, right? Transparency and clear division of a responsibility. But I love what you said about the differentiation between the industry and the healthcare organizations. For me, looking at the vision of the future and knowing what I've learned about the importance of standardization within the regulation, I know we're advancing and learning a lot still, but if we can find that common language, I think we start to chip away at those black box problems, right? Like, how can we have a common ground of communication to make sure that everybody understands what's happening and what our role is in that relationship?
And that will actually help with the apportionment of, the issues that wind up in dispute or wind up in liability issues. And, we have to talk the same language.
So I'm gonna come back to that point, Michelle, because I think talking the same language pulls up a couple really important closing thoughts for us about interoperability, about data sharing across institutions, and David, maybe we'll even get to slip in a plug for the Health AI partnership, which we haven't roped Michelle into yet, but we will. But before we do, I'm not going to let you off the hook on the black box problem. You said black box problem, and my question for you is it really a problem? And let me, I'm going to make it very precise to force you to wrestle with a tough one. But, I was on a panel yesterday at a data analytics conference with several data scientists and from other industries. And I was making the point that there is a assumed traditional trade-off between explainability and accuracy. And I think very smart data scientists can argue about whether that's always true or not. I've certainly talked to senior engineers at Google and places that are very good at data analytics who say, no, you can have explainability without losing accuracy. I've spoken to really good senior comparable engineers who say, no, that's usually not the case. But just to set the table for the audience, explainability being the idea that a human can understand why an algorithm is making a recommendation that it does. It can follow the reasoning. And accuracy being how likely is a recommendation to be right? Can the AI's recommendation avoid false positives and false negatives, which both have different and often very important harms? And a lot of engineers think the more you can explain what the computer's doing, the more simplistic that algorithm is, and then the less accurate it will be. And there's this sort of inherent trade-off. And the example I always give is, if my 6-year-old comes up to me and says, "Daddy, what's gravity?" I say, "Oh, well, it's when you let go of an apple and it falls and hits the ground." That's a very explainable, understandable version of gravity, but you're not going to use that to put a man on the moon. Your spaceship will probably crash if you're like, "Oh, what happens if I drop an apple?" Okay, we'll point the ship this way. Probably want some PhD level physicists making those calculations. So at a very dumb level, at least, there is some trade-off between explainability and accuracy. So David, the question for you, you're at the Mayo Clinic, or since we're not speaking for employers today, you're at an unnamed hypothetical healthcare system, and you've got a great red alert system sitting over the electronic health record, scanning through, let's say, a terabyte of data a day, looking at 1 trillion data points that are all flickering imperceptibly to the human mind, and through some impossible to understand combination of those trillion data points, they say, this person needs an immediate intervention. Doctor, get to room 24, immediately operate on this person. They've got 5 minutes to live. There's no ability to second guess that, no human intelligence or test that's available that can confirm or deny. I'm not going to say, does the doctor accept or ignore, but I am going to say, as the lawyer to that doctor, how would you counsel that doctor? When does the doctor accept? When does it ignore? And do we even know?
Yeah, so this is a tough scenario because I live mostly at all of the stages that should have occurred before that situation happened, right?
You're fighting my hypothetical, but yes,
I know.
Prevention, so please.
So, the obligation on both parties to make sure that thing was built and validated to serve a specific function before it even gets to healthcare, that's all of record, right? That's all important information that would go into, what ultimately should happen in that scenario. But I think where your hypothetical is going is some of these are imperceptible, impossible human calculations to perform, right? And let's say that algorithm is robust and it's validated and then the doctor is being told to do something. I think at the time that algorithm was implemented, I think that they made a choice that was a function that was valuable to their practice and benefited patients without, the risk benefit ratio was in favor of deploying that algorithm. And then they would have to act accordingly at that point. I believe they've made that decision and they can't ignore a tool that they've put into clinical practice, like many tools, right? An MRI machine that might make a certain, like, you find a lesion or some sort of problem in an MRI machine, you can't just ignore it because you don't trust the technology. So, but to me, it's all about the work that went up leading to that situation more than the actual decision at the time, because I think the decision at the time is the consequence of all that prior work.
I would agree with David on that one, but and it's not a but, it's an and, right? It's when you are making that decision to put an algorithm that is a life or death decision into the stream of your workflow, you literally would have had to say that I've evaluated it, I believe in it, and the risk of not doing it is greater than doing it. So one would hope that that risk benefit analysis starts to change when you're getting to the point of these acute decisions that the technology is making, and literally do not lead to the ability to kind of step back and think, right? We have to recognize that in many instances, technology is there because there's no better alternative. And if there is no better alternative, if there's nothing that can otherwise take the place of that, or let's say you would have had to conduct 10 other tests, or maybe you never would have had technology to point that this person was in an acute distress situation, and therefore you're already on the operating table and you're just hoping that you're going to save the person, right? I would hope that we get ourselves to a point where we recognize that if we're putting that life-threatening decision into the stream of a workflow, it's because there was nothing better there. And so, yeah, unfortunately, you might be in a position in which the AI is sometimes wrong, but you've looked at how often that AI is sometimes wrong, and otherwise understand how often that life-threatening decision otherwise causes death or serious bodily harm. Again, it's a risk-benefit judgment and analysis. And I'm of the belief, I know I kind of said, like, the doctor always is there to kind of use their judgment. To David's point, that judgment would have had to be made before that algorithm was actually put into use. And now you have bought into that.
I'm going to pause because I'm reminded that a mundane but necessary thing I have to do is to tell you that the 8th code for your CLE credit is conflict. So let me repeat that again, and I'm told it even helps to spell it: conflict, CONFLICT, and that is your 8th code. I felt very official doing that. Back to the fireworks. So I hear what you're saying, Michelle, and I really like that, this idea of what is the best alternative available. And if this tool is really on whole better than what's available, then we embrace it, knowing it's imperfect. And I even heard David go a step further and suggest maybe at that point, there is a default assumption that you don't override the machine, because whatever the, to use the medical terms or statistical terms, sensitivity and specificity are, the false positive and false negative rate, even accepting that all in, you're still in a better place for patients than whatever the alternative is. Let me ask this question to David. That's a really interesting assessment. Is FDA making it?
Well, your hypothetical was a very high level of risk. So in that case, the FDA would. So that would be filtered through the FDA to essentially what the FDA would do is look at the conditions being treated and the situation in which it lives in and make a risk determination. And then they would have a specialty panel that then would expect that this thing is as good or better than the existing clinical standard of care. And then it becomes the obligation of the manufacturer of that algorithm to prove that to the FDA, which for the high risk algorithms, you're talking about multi-site validation, you're talking about potentially even a prospective study, lots of cost and effort that would go into making that determination. And because of the risk, it would have to be filtered through the FDA based on what I heard about the risk level.
Yes, and David, do you mind giving this group, and I'm happy to pitch in too, just a 20-second overview of how is the FDA looking at the risk assessment stratification sort of approach to regulating AI?
Yeah, so it's entirely based on risk. And basically, the higher the risk, the more controls, the more obligations that the manufacturer of those algorithms would have. But I'll be honest, it's a bit of a patchwork right now. And that's part of the issue from industry, is trying to figure out what's FDA's interpretation, FDA looks to some of the international standards, which have similar interpretations, but not a direct corollary. And then we also have congressional acts. So the 21st Century Cures Act is another thing that is inserted into the equation. But essentially, if we're talking about something that doesn't meet the definition of a medical device, or is a low risk workflow aid, or general health and wellness application, or even in some cases, the electronic health record itself, those typically fall outside of the need to go to the FDA. And if we step it up a degree and we start to have a little bit more influence over care, maybe we're talking about a specific condition, but still low risk, that might fall into an FDA regulated space where you have obligations to have quality system controls in place, but you still may not need to go to the FDA. And then we get into the algorithms that you do have to go to the FDA for. And right now, I think at last check, there's only around 80 algorithms that the FDA has cleared. Software as a medical device algorithms that the FDA has, but it's only 80, which, I mean, there's, I think up to 20,000 publications a year on medical algorithms, and only 80 have been cleared by the FDA. So there's not a whole lot that have gone under FDA scrutiny. But when you get to that point, that's where you start to have strong obligations of quality system controls. FDA has a say in whether you're meeting this clinical standard of care, sensitivity, specificity, and prospective or retrospective trials. Their FDA's eyes would be on those. Is that the full answer?
No, it's a good answer. And I was going to be even more candid, but I won't say anything I haven't said to friends at the FDA in having these conversations. But, you know, there is as you said, a carve out to the regulatory scope. Some of it's literally carved out by the Cures Act, and then some of it is sort of enforcement discretion. But I mean, I can't tell you how many conversations I have a week when you really read the fine print of the guidance, which is still draft guidance, that exception, that carve out is very, very small. I mean, the definition of inform, which is the lowest level, versus an algorithm that drives or actually treats the condition, it's a very small slice. So a lot of people kind of assume they're not subject to FDA regulation because of this carve out, but haven't really gone through and read the definitions. And I mean, I think you'd agree, David. I see it's very small what isn't sort of considered regulatable AI.
I think it's worth actually putting emphasis on that point, and I didn't really touch on that specific. So there's a category of software called clinical decision support. That's about as gray as we get when it comes to trying to piece together this patchwork of regulations. What I described are kind of earlier as sort of the clear exempt categories, like you're not regulated versus the, hey, you're in regulated. But there's this big gray area bubble called clinical decision support. And especially when folks read in the 21st Century Cures Act, clinical decision support doesn't qualify for FDA. I think the assumption as well, if I'm just helping a clinician, I'm not regulated. But it's really important to understand, and maybe if this is the one takeaway from this call, there is clinical decision support that is not regulated in accordance with that 21st Century Cures Act. But then there's clinical decision support that is very clearly regulated in accordance with the FDA's interpretation of that act. And so that is a risk analysis, and as Danny described, it's fitting very specific definitions. An example of the non-regulated type would be something like an algorithm that pulls a bunch of information from the electronic health record and presents that to the clinician to inform them. So for example, all of the information related to that person's cholesterol, low risk, in just informing the clinician, hey, this is the scope of that person, so that the healthcare physician doesn't have to go through all of the records and get it themselves. A higher risk version of that, however, would be based on that information, we are going to drive your care in this way, or we're going to, and in fact, even that gets low because it's low risk, but yeah.
even an algorithm, I think, and again, this is as gray as it gets, if it's just taking all that information and following some published industry accepted calculator to put it together, definitely out.
Yeah.
But if it's going the next step and using some machine learning to say, based on all of this stuff, we recommend you go in for a second level screening. You know, as benign as that is, you may have just crossed into regulation territory. And I can tell you there's a lot of software out there on the market, none of our clients, that haven't gone through regulatory that are doing just that. And the barrier to entry is so low. I mean, any kid in a garage can download app generators and algorithm generators like TensorFlow and just, you know, put some data in from a public source and say, ah, I did it. So it's uncharted territory. Michelle, for you, you mentioned pharmacovigilance, which is something obviously the pharma industry is very, very good at, continuing to monitor their products once they're released into the wild, which a TV maker doesn't do. Or, you know, there's most industries, you make your product, you sell it, and, you know, it goes off. AI, I think, is going to make pharmacovigilance even harder because, as you said, things change. They shift and they drift, which is sort of, you know, incidental changes. And then, you know, one day there will be continuously learning apps out there that are authorized to actually change their own model as they go and not just react to new data, but really change in unpredictable ways. FDA has said, you know, there's going to be change control plans and you know, we'll know which changes require new review and which don't. As a company used to sort of monitoring, do you think that's far away? Do you think that's obtainable? Are you worried about this yet, or is it science fiction?
Unfortunately, I don't think it's science fiction, and I think it is fastly becoming, you know, where we are and where we need to be. So I would, you know, it's incumbent upon us, you know, we often have to say to people in our, you know, data world, we're Pfizer. So even if you could be somewhere else and you could be doing this one way, the question is, should we responsibly be doing it this way when we understand really the environment that we're in and how to make sure that we are doing what's best for patients, right? Like, we always keep patients at the, you know, base of what we're doing. And so while it's going to be difficult to continue to get the policies and processes in place, we need to lead the charge in this. We need to make sure that we understand at which levels along that AI continuum our obligations are becoming more rigorous, because they should, right? Because responsibly, this is what needs to happen. And, you know, it's whether it's because I've been at pharma for so long, or whether it's because I just truly believe in the cause of science, it's probably meshing for both in me. But I really have a strong belief that if pharma does not take a stand in doing this and doing this right, everybody loses, because the pharmaceutical industry is the one that is really involved in ensuring that we continue to develop, we continue to research. So we're oftentimes the one that understand firsthand if we're dealing with those diseases and conditions that are so hard to treat and we don't have cures for. That's what pharma is doing. That's what they're trying to do. So to say that we have to now stop and we shouldn't be engaging in this artificial intelligence to help the doctors understand what we saw, to help them find it, we're doing everybody a disservice, especially the patients. So how can we just make sure that as we're developing, we understand the gatekeeping aspects of ensuring that what we're putting out there remains fit for purpose, responsible, and has the rigor to help people understand why we think it's doing what it's doing. To your point, Danny, there's a point at which you want that algorithm to continue to learn, because that's the beauty of what we have in technology, that it could do so faster and better than a human mind, or take some redundant information and synthesize it to get us an answer that we otherwise couldn't have. But with that comes the responsibility to make sure we understand what rules of the road these scientists put in place to learn, and that we can pick out when, you know what, there's something about this data that we didn't think about. And so is there a group of people or conditions that we're not accounting for that we need to advise people of? So it's hard, there's no doubt about it, but we have to come to a place where pharmacovigilance means the same thing in technology as it does in science.
I'll just echo that before we transition to the next code and then to questions. You've got a tech culture and you've got a medical biotech culture, and I work with both of them, and their cultures cannot be more different. Technology is move fast, break things, disrupt, and that's not the culture in a highly regulated space where there's standards of good clinical trial practice that go back, centuries, and maybe a long time. And I often hear my more traditional life science player clients bemoan that they feel like they can't compete. They've got one hand tied behind their back because they can't move as quickly as the tech startups that really aren't used to and don't really worry about the highly regulated space because they're not repeat players in it, and they're not living or dying on those sorts of things. So I do think in the spirit of conflict resolution and prevention, a unified system of quality in AI across sectors, or at least across high risk sectors, is key. And maybe, David, that's a chance for a 30-second pitch for the Health AI partnership.
Yeah, so the Health AI partnership is with Danny and DLA Piper, Duke University, Berkeley, and Mayo Clinic. And really it's a means to try to bring together healthcare organizations to help identify what type of standards we should be using with cross communication. Michelle, you talked about healthcare organizations being a little bit in a category of their own. It's true. And I think that finding that alignment, and again, with my bias, I'm trying to bring to the table, aligning that to broader industry and regulatory infrastructure is, I think, a really great way to help mitigate and prevent risk and increase our ability to communicate about these products that are being built and used with patient care. The partnership is really initially focused on how do we vet AI. Mm-hmm. If a healthcare organization is going to purchase AI and bring it into their house, what are some of the common standard questions that we should ask to make sure that we're getting the right thing? It's not biased, and it's not, it's transparent. It's built in a way that's going to be safe and effective for our patients.
And many of these questions are going to be at the core of the standards that we're hopefully evolving. It's a pro bono project for us, I should say. This is not product placement in any sense, but we just heard over and over from clients, how can I design when I don't know what the rules of the road are? I want to do it the right way. I don't know what the right way is. And so that's the goal here. And we are sponsored by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, I should say that too, who is really, it's a nonprofit effort. And we look forward to working with regulatory bodies and others to try to get all the stakeholders together and align these views.
And it's open source as well. So if
yes.
anybody that would want those materials as we produce them.
Yeah, they will all be available to, our view is not everybody is lucky enough to have the resources of a Mayo Clinic or a Pfizer to build these controls internally. And we want community hospitals to know this is what good AI looks like. This is what bad AI looks like. Please buy this, not that. And we're not going to tell you what to buy, but we're going to tell you how to kick the tires, what questions to ask. The 9th code, excitingly, is healthcare, HEALTHCARE. So 8th code was conflict, 9th code was healthcare. We've got 10 minutes. Why don't we open it up to questions? And I'll pitch in with my panelists to field those. Let's see, I can read some, actually, they're coming in. First question, what is the intersection of these new technologies? How does cost influence the use or avoidance of technology in care? Well, that's a great question. I think you guys could answer that from very different perspectives. David, you want to start as sort of the consumer?
Yeah, I was, well, I guess consumer.
Maker,
I was
consumer.
thinking, my first thinking on that was about barrier to entry, right? These healthcare algorithms, if you're taking what Danny was just talking about with like the tech industry, right? Build quick, break things and move quickly, very low cost to entry. Whereas when we look at our healthcare organizations, right now, it's a really, really high cost to entry, especially if it's a little bit higher risk and subject to these FDA controls. I think the FDA and the Federal Register came out about a year ago with some analysis that indicated that it's at least $2.5 million or more to try to go through the FDA process for an algorithm. So big difference between the guy who can, get TensorFlow and build it in their back, in their garage versus that. But I think what I'm hoping to see is a lower barrier to entry by adopting some of those efficiencies that the tech companies do have. I think there's a lot of value in seeing how can we automate some things? How can we produce documentation in a way that's easier? And how, with the collaborative and what Michelle was saying, how do we bring together these unified processes in a way that it's easier to predict what needs to happen and what to do rather than meandering and struggling throughout it. But as we lower the cost of entry, I feel like the cost equation is going to get more and more favorable, where people are going to start to say, well, based on risk, I'd actually rather do that FDA required risk analysis that produces requirements and labeling and communications about my device, because I'll have a much lower risk as I deploy that thing. And I know that it's a little bit easier than it used to be, because that's getting easier and more streamlined and sophisticated in how to comply with the regulation. There's going to be a threshold that we're going to hit by doing that all of a sudden, I think we're going to have a great balance of people have the confidence and ability to go into healthcare with these algorithms and satisfy the regulations and those risk requirements at the same time. So I look forward to that point. That's my longer vision.
I agree with you, David, and I actually am constantly pushing people into that regulatory framework, right? And it gets met with resistance oftentimes because of the thought of the time barrier, and you can't be as innovative and you can't move as quickly. But ultimately, especially as pharma, it seems again to be the responsible thing to do, so that what you can say, what you can't say, and how to say it. This issue of cost, when I hear the issue of cost and technology, and I'm sitting in pharma as a lawyer, it is the question that really, I wrangle with a lot, because again, this is the difference between where David sits and where I sit, right? What can you put into the stream of commerce? How can you put it there? We have barriers to what we can do because of things like the anti-kickback statute. And it concerns me in some respect, because I oftentimes think that maybe this anti-kickback statute has not evolved the way that it should evolve to ensure that healthcare can adapt with the knowledge and expertise that exists around the entire healthcare ecosystem. So there's, not probably in the manner in which the question was phrased, but the way I think about it, there's an avoidance issue that I grapple with day in and day out, just because we have to keep in mind that in our industry and the way we are judged by what we could put into that ecosystem is different than what somebody else might be able to do in that ecosystem. And it is creating its own barrier and, issues. So.
Yeah, I'll just pile on. I couldn't agree more with both of those comments. And I've been beside both of you in those conversations. I mean, when I have startup clients, so many times they're coming at from a different perspective, Michelle, than, like we're Pfizer, we do it the right way. Because they're like, hey, I'm just starting out. I got to make this work. I don't have a budget. And they say, how can I design this so that I don't need to go through the regulatory pathway? And there's always this default assumption that regulation is something you want to stay out of. And David, your point, which it's something I say over and over again, is first, let's talk about the benefits of regulation, because there's downsides, and you know those. It's expensive, it takes time, although sometimes not as much time as you think. But there's a lot of benefits too to have a label and have limitations and warnings and things you can stand behind. So yeah, I feel like that's the first conversation, and then, you know, at the end of the day, the question is always what's safe and best for patients. I mean, that's why we all do what we do, whether we're lawyers or scientists or doctors, is we're trying to help people heal or prevent disease. And that I always tell people, if you remember that, you're probably going to stay out of trouble. And then it's keep that benchmark. I think there's time for maybe one more question. Michelle, I'm going to kick this to you to start with, because I know this was an issue that we talked about for this panel that you were curious about raising. But someone was saying, how do you deal with the problem of maybe your AI is validated, in scope, good to go for a particular use, but how do you keep someone out there from using it for something else that it's not fit for? And I'll segue from that to the topic you and I mentioned for this panel, which is there's a big difference between putting out a device. I mean, they're all devices in the FDA's view, but a old-fashioned physical box device, and putting out an algorithm and even possibly source code in the academic literature, which could be modified and manipulated in unintended ways. To tell us a little bit about how you approach those issues.
This one I find to be one of the trickiest issues, right? Because when you put something, a physical device out there, you see what that physical thing is. You can, see it, you can feel it, you can, understand what it visually is. When you put that algorithm out there, the question is, how do you ensure that people know what you're putting out there, what we intend it to be for, and how it can be used? And I think, arguably speaking, you'll be in the regulated space, but this is tricky, right? Because it's the algorithm, it's not what you intended to do at the end stage for it. But I do think you still have those same responsibilities to ensure that you are explaining to people, here are the limitations. This is what I did. This is the test data that I used, and these are the qualifications about that data. We have to make sure that regardless of what we know or what we don't know, we are explaining what we know, and we are explaining what we don't know, right? And we're in a place where we can kind of give people the information that they need to figure out whether they're going to take that algorithm and put it somewhere. And they know that if they put it somewhere, this is what it was intended to do, and this is how we intended to use it. But you kind of lose some level of control. And we have to make sure that we understand whether we can lose control from a regulatory standpoint, right? Maybe we can't. Maybe we must have this locked and in a way that it can't go anywhere else until it's used in a certain way. But in my mind, it all goes back to, whether or not it's regulated or not regulated, in my mind, doesn't matter. You still want to be able to explain what it is that it is doing and what it is not doing and what you intended to do for it. In my mind, that's what it's about.
I will piggyback on that with a real world example, anonymized, of course, but I was brought into a project by a software developer that developed digital health applications. And this was not a regulated device. It was for economic purposes. But when you looked at it from the perspective of someone who had seen things go right and things go wrong, you could see how someone else could take that and use it for a regulated purpose. It sort of had the look and feel of something that could be used in a medical context and not just an economic context, healthcare economic context. And so our solution was to load it up with exactly what Michelle's describing, the types of labels and warnings, and thinking about even as simple as when it prints out this healthcare economic report, have warnings and disclaimers that are automatically water stamped on to say, This is an economic analysis. It is not validated for medical decision-making, because sometimes a unregulated software application can have outputs that look very much like a regulated purpose, and you can't blame people for not being able to tell the difference without a big flashing sign. So yeah, the whole idea that FDA is going to regulate some things and not others very much presumes what the questioner was worried about, which is, are things going to stay within their lane as they are released out? And so yeah, warnings, limitations, labels, even on things that don't have to have them. If they're not regulated, the common law may one day say they ought to have had a label. So good to think of that in advance. We're at time, but we have enough questions that we could do probably a whole nother hour and a half. So we'll save those for another day, but appreciate everyone who wrote. These are all fascinating and thorny questions that we could dig into. But let me thank first of all our panelists, David and Michelle, for sharing their real world expertise dealing with these issues. And again, thanks CPR for having us. We're really fantastic audience to be in front of.